From across the field, the proud Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, watched the enemy come out from the forest. The Battle of Grandson was about to begin. It was the year 1476 of our Lord in Western Europe. The Duchy of Burgundy was entailed in a series of conflicts against the Swiss Confederacy that would be later known as the Burgundian Wars. The Duke Charles I of Burgundy, nicknamed the Bold for his ambitious plans, had recently captured the Swiss-held city of Grandson. When the city surrendered, the survivors were executed as an intimidation tactic. Almost 1,000 people were hanged from the trees or drowned in the nearby river. Soon, the Swiss response to this barbaric act arrived in the form of a relief army of 18,000 men. Arriving the 1st of March of 1476, they laid camp at the town of Bevay. Inner quarrel had delayed the Swiss reinforcements, allowing Charles to encamp north of Grandson and prepare for the battle. A dense forest separated the Burgundians from the Swiss, crossed by a river. Both sides were connected through 2 roads, which Charles managed to block before the Swiss advance. The Burgundian host had a favorable position. Heavy artillery and cavalry, and 2 vanguards blocking the way of their enemy. They also enjoyed superiority in numbers, with around 20,000 men at their disposal. The odds were heavily in favor of Charles the Bold, so the Swiss resorted to draw the enemy away from their position. During the night, the Swiss launched a surprise attack on the 2 Burgundian blockades. After fierce fighting, one of the Burgundian garrisons fell back, opening the way for the Swiss army. The morning of March the 2nd, Charles the Bold honored his nickname by leaving behind his advantageous position and closing in on the forest. When the first Swiss came out of the tree line, the massive Burgundian army was still on the move. However, the Swiss vanguard were too few in numbers to attack and waited for the rest of the infantry to arrive. From across the field, the proud Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, watched the enemy come out from the forest and form a massive pike square. The Battle of Grandson was about to begin. The Duke of Burgundy knew that the more he waited, the more men joined the enemy formation. When he had the chance, he fired his cannons towards the Swiss pike square. After the artillery barrage, the Burgundian cavalry darted forward so as to break the enemy formation. After this failed attack, the Burgundian cavalry retreated. Despite the bombardment, the Swiss pike square had survived the attack. The Duke of Burgundy commanded a full-on bombardment on the enemy formation, for which his troops had to move out of the way of his guns. During this rearrangement, the last of the Swiss reinforcements arrived, and the whole of their army marched towards Charles' disorganized men. The Burgundian army realized they had been taken on the wrong foot and started fleeing. Despite the fact that the Swiss had obtained a victory against all odds, they failed to capitalize on it. They looted the war camp left behind by the Burgundian army, and they simply reinforced the frontier regions. But Charles' vengeance would soon arrive. It was spring of the year 1476. The Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, rallied his troops in the city of Lausanne after his defeat at the Battle of Grandson. The Swiss army had caught their enemy disorganized and had routed them rather quickly. This meant that even though the Burgundian host had disbanded, casualties on both sides had been minimal, and Charles' army was still intact. With the Burgundian host stood Jack of Savoy, close friend of Charles the Bold and Count of Ramont, one of the fiefs of Savoy. Therefore, Jack widened the Burgundian army with Savoyan troops. Overall, Charles the Bold's host amounted to 23,000 men. On May 27th, Charles marched towards the city of Bern. The Swiss Canon of Bern was governed at the time by Schultheiss Adrian von Bubenberg, the most belligerent of the Swiss leaders. Charles had correctly identified von Bubenberg as the main supporter of the Swiss war against Burgundy, and thus sought to rid himself of the Canon of Bern. Von Bubenberg, aware that the first Bernese town the enemy would meet was Murten, traveled to the city and prepared the defenses. Charles' army arrived on the 11th of June. Immediately, Charles put Jack of Savoy in charge of the siege, and the bombardment began.
Artillery crew, they are machine!
While this was taking place, Charles sent several vanguards to secure bridgeheads over River Surrey, which he would cross after taking Murten. However, the Swiss were waiting for the Burgundians in Laupen, Gummenen, and Arberg, and heavy fighting ensued. Ultimately, the Burgundians failed to secure any crossing for the River Surrey, and triggered the defensive alliance between the Swiss cantons. Armies from the Swiss Confederacy started to muster behind the river. The Swiss pikemen were joined by the Duchy of Lorraine, under Duke René II himself.
Einheiten, Standardformation!
Men from Swabia and Alsace widened the Confederate army even more. The 18th of June, before the Swiss army was ready for battle, the Burgundian cannons tore down a section of the wall. Vicious assault followed. After 11 hours of fighting, before the Savoyan troops could breach the city, Duke Charles halted the attack. News had arrived of the enemy army, laying camp at the nearby town of Olmütz. Charles aimed to avoid getting caught unprepared, like had happened at the Battle of Grandson. The Duke refrained from trying to take Murten by storm, so as to keep the whole of his fighting force ready. During the next couple of days, Charles the Bold had his army form up several times under false alarms, but the Swiss attack didn't seem to come. The rainy morning of the 22nd of June, the Burgundian army was somewhat demoralized, and the Duke of Burgundy had lost the trust of his men. In an attempt to solve this, and confident the Swiss wouldn't attack that day either, Charles commanded the entire army to be paid. For this matter, the first line of defense against the Swiss, a defensive palisade just before the forest, nicknamed the Grunhag, was left almost unprotected. While the Burgundian defenders of the Grunhag were waiting for their turn to return to the camp and collect their pay, a terrible sight appeared in front of them. The Swiss, who had been waiting for reinforcements until the night before, marched against their enemy, pike in hand. After a bloody melee, the Swiss finally managed to surpass the Grunhag. Back in the Burgundian camp, panic broke out as the men were once again not ready for battle. The Duke himself managed to assemble his cavalry and charged the incoming knights of Rene II of Lorraine. During the struggle between the two dukes and their retinues, the Lorrainian knights managed to rout their enemy. Charles the Bold took flight, narrowly escaping death. In the camp, the unprepared Burgundian troops were slaughtered. The Battle of Murten was a disaster for Charles the Bold. Half of his army was killed, his reputation was stained, and his desire for vengeance grew even stronger. But he had lived to fight another day, and the war was not over yet. Swiss horns sounded across the valley, and their feared pikemen came out of the forest, behind the Burgundian army. As the Burgundian knights were rearranging their line, the Swiss charged downhill. The decisive Battle of Nancy that would end the Burgundian Wars was about to begin. The 22nd of October, 1476, the Duke of Burgundy, Charles I the Bold, laid siege to the city of Nancy, capital city of the Duchy of Lorraine. 10 months after his terrible defeat at the Battle of Murten, Charles had, for the third time in the same year, raised a new army and marched to war. He had picked Nancy as his target because the Duchy of Lorraine seemed an easier target than the Swiss Confederacy. The timing of the siege of Nancy had been a poor decision by Charles, as his men would have to spend the winter outside the city. René II, Duke of Lorraine, began assembling his army as soon as the siege started. The Swiss Confederacy, next to whom René had fought earlier this summer in the Battle of Murten, decided to not intervene directly. However, they authorized the Duke of Lorraine to hire their mercenaries, which he did, with economical support from the King of France. The morning of the 5th of January, Charles had been informed that the relief army was close and commanded his troops to take up battle positions. The Duke of Burgundy had placed his artillery in the front of the formation. Behind his cannons laid the mighty Burgundian infantry. At his flanks, his cavalry awaited impatiently. Both sides of the army were guarded by densely wooded hills. Overall, Charles had only managed to raise around 8,000 men, notably less than the previous battles, for his own supporters had grown weary of joining him in battle. Most of his companies of gendarmes were made up of only half their original numbers, and even his personal retinue was remarkably low in numbers. A short march away, the Lorrainian army scouted their enemy. Knowing that a frontal charge against the Burgundians would be suicidal, René II and his commanders opted for a different strategy. A slim detachment of handgunners would approach Charles' army head-on as a distraction force, while the Lorrainian forces awaited in the rear, and the Swiss mercenaries flanked the enemy through the forest. Overall, René II's army was made up of around 20,000 men, of which around 10,000 were from Alsace and Lorraine, and 10,000 were Swiss mercenaries. Almost half of the Lorrainian men were cavalry. As the forces of the Duchy of Lorraine set up their plan, Charles the Bold awaited patiently, confident in his positioning. The decisive Battle of Nancy was about to begin. It was still snowing when the Lorrainian host initiated their advance. The Swiss mercenaries marched into the forest, towards Charles' right flank. Through the mist appeared the Lorrainian arquebuses. Snow slowly ceased to fall. Swiss horns sounded off beyond Charles' right flank. Before the horrified eyes of the Burgundians, thousands of pikemen emerged from the forest and formed up for a charge. Heavy Burgundian cavalry were the first to engage the Swiss pikes. Charles attempted to turn his infantry against the charging enemy, but to no avail. The first few minutes were decisive for the outcome of the battle. soon, the Burgundian knights retreated, unable to break the Swiss pike walls. Seeing their allies charge the enemy, the Lorrainian and Alsatian troops marched towards the enemy. Seeing himself surrounded, Charles committed his cavalry reserves. The die was cast. Around half an hour later, many Burgundians started to break their formation and fled towards Nancy. However, for Charles the Bold, who had fled from the field the two previous battles, retreat was not an option anymore. The personal guard of the Duke were surrounded, dismounted, and massacred where they stood. Finally, after an agonizing last stand, the last Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, met his end. The Battle of Nancy was over. Now there would be an onslaught. By the end of the day, René II of Lorraine was victorious. The Battle of Nancy was the end for Charles the Bold, as well as for the Burgundian State. Of the 8,000 Burgundians that had heeded Charles' call, 7,000 lay dead, a mortality rate unbelievably high for a medieval battle. After Nancy, René II consolidated the Duchy of Lorraine, which would remain independent for centuries to come. As for the Duchy of Burgundy, Charles had perished without a male heir, and the land was torn between the Holy Roman Emperor, who had married Charles' daughter, and the King of France, who now claimed the duchy as compensation for his support to René.